All right, we've got an interesting conversation here with Carleton University Ph.D. student Patrick Thomas, who took on an amateur MMA fight as part of his doctoral studies. His dissertation focuses on analyzing the intersections of MMA and Midwestern identity within the regional framing of Kansas City. Hello, professor or PhD student.
I'm working that way. Thank you for the introduction. Just a little background information going further. I was actually born and raised in the Kansas City area. I had a chance to study martial arts and mixed martial arts before being a researcher. And I got into an undergrad program and had a professor who pushed me to study things I already loved. So I always joke that I just started writing about fist fighting, and it's snowballed and snowballed and snowballed. And now I'm at Carleton, finishing up my dissertation, focusing on MMA in Kansas City. Fighting was always something I loved, and I wanted to fight an amateur MMA fight. And I'm really proud that it ended up being part of my dissertation research.
This is really, really cool and interesting. If I could just go back, but before we dive into it, this professor during your undergrad years, they give you really good advice, clearly, to pursue your passion as to what you should be researching about. Tell us what was your undergrad? What did you study during your undergrad? And from there, tell us about your transition into graduate work and what inspired this particular theme of the intersection of MMA, Midwest identity within the regional framing of Kansas City.
So it's a little bit of a messy story, but we'll work with it.
We got time.
I originally actually went to college to wrestle in 2009. Wow. And dropped out after a semester. I didn't enjoy my time. And so then I was out of college for probably 3 or 4 years, just working, trying to make a little money, and found out I didn't enjoy manual labor. So I decided I was going to get a history degree. And the University of Central Missouri was a cheap place that was near me. I was lucky enough to have gone through a community college to make the first 2 years of my schooling even cheaper. I got to UCM, and I didn't really like how history professors were pushing the students towards things. I really wanted to work in museums. They wanted to push this thing called public history. So I ended up talking with an anthropology professor who ended up running the museum at the university as well. I took a couple of her courses, and she always had an essay at the end of the semester. She always left the subject open as long as you could frame it within anthropological theory. And I convinced her to let me write an ethnography on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Wow. For a short project where I interviewed 3 or 4 of the people that I grappled with at UCM. And that was one of my final projects. And she kind of sat me down and told me, like, hey, if you want to do this museum thing, maybe anthropology works a little better. So I changed majors from history to anthropology. I ended up with a minor in history and graduated from UCM and went to Texas Tech to study museum science. When I got to Texas Tech, I did the museum science program for about a year, but didn't really like it again. I got put into an exhibits department, which is cool. Making exhibits is a lot of fun, but I found myself doing a lot of the manual labor that forced me to go back into college. I was building a lot of walls, moving artwork and stuff like that, which is great. I just didn't feel as fulfilled as I wanted to. And I ended up talking to that previous professor, and she said, hey, talk to the anthropology department. You can do that. You've already shown you can do research. It might be hard, but if you want to, try it. At Texas Tech University, the professor who ended up becoming my advisor had done research with capoeira. It just so happened that there was another martial artist at the school. She took me under her wing, and we had a crash course in a year where I ended up doing my master's research over summer break or excuse me, over winter break for about 6 weeks, and then came back, wrote my thesis, and defended it by May.
Wow.
I was applying to a bunch of other schools. Carleton accepted me. I originally came up with this idea of like comparing Canadian MMA to Midwestern MMA, and then it just kind of worked towards building on my previous research, which my MA's thesis was on a fight church community, which is an MMA gym that's connected to an evangelical church for crossover participation, in that they want women and children participating in the MMA gym while bringing men into the church spaces. So we worked on building kind of upon that, and instead of just focusing on religiosity, kind of shifting towards the concepts of the Midwestern identity. And that's about where I'm at right now, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I was following along. Very, very interesting journey and path. It sounds to me like you're someone who listens to your feelings and how you feel. If you're in a program that you don't like, you're not going to sit there and force yourself through it. You're going to find, something that works for you and pursue that. But all those themes and all those, like those on as a standalone episode, like I'm sure you could, talk for hours about each of those themes and different research topics that you explored. But let's dive into this, your dissertation. Please give us an overview of it in plain language and kind of and explain your approach or your methodology, how you went about it.
Okay. So I'm going to use some theoretical language, and if you need further clarification, just holler and I'll try to explain it further. But my main focus for my methodology is this concept called participant observation. A lot of anthropology is done this way, but I think the easiest way to think of it is that like we learn by doing. So if I want to learn like the cultural landscape of a community, I need to participate within it to the extent that I can. Being that I was essentially a native in the terms of like not indigenous,
right,
as in that I'm from Kansas City, born and raised, I had a ton of access that allowed me to, I don't want to say fully participate, but I was allowed into spaces based upon that I had known people for 20, 25 years that were professionals in the MMA community. I had connections way before even trying to do any sort of research. And so my real goal was to just live the life of a Midwestern MMA fighter. COVID happened and it kind of messed up some things. I ended up staying in the field for a longer time than I wanted, but a lot of really positive things happened for me down there. I lost a lot of weight because I was training all the time and I was finally eating correctly. And it really kind of made me think of, you were talking about how I try to think like follow my feelings. I tried to feel what it felt to be an MMA fighter. There was moments like which I talk about in my dissertation, but of like having a fight fall through and like how angry and depressed and all those things felt to me. And I think that's kind of what we need to learn. I think you can kind of plot out all these different things of like, these people do this, these people do this, these people do this, these people do this. And I think we need to know why they do it and how that makes them feel. And so that's also why I wanted to participate in an MMA fight. I felt it would be kind of hypocritical to say like, hey, I'm trying to live life as a Midwestern MMA fighter and then just not going in there. I've had a lot of pushback on that. Some people thought it was really dangerous and it maybe sets a bad precedent for other researchers. Not that it was dangerous for me to get into a fight, although like I can see their argument to that. But what does that mean for people who could potentially read my stuff in the future? Well, if they're coming up with something dangerous, they saw me deal with it. That doesn't necessarily create a good reciprocal action. So
I don't mean to cut you off. This is really interesting, but you had the prerequisites to do MMA because you wrestled initially.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
you had one of the best foundations as far as one aspect of MMA and combat sports, which is the wrestling aspect. So it's not like you
Yeah.
were at a disadvantage, right?
No, and I don't, and I think that's why they allowed me to do it. There's just a fear of like,
Injury.
well, not just that, like people study other things, and so if you're in another studying, not even martial arts, but say you're studying political activism,
Right.
it might convince them to do something
Oh, I see where you're
against
going with that. Yes.
against their own well-being.
Right.
And those are really tough conversations we have to have. But at the end of the day, I think you got to fight to study fighting, which kind of sucks. I don't want to kind of gatekeep it that the able body is the hierarchy of producing good literature, but it's tough. You got to fight to know what it feels like to get hit and to be tired and to be depressed because you've been getting hit and all of these things like that. So yeah, not to ramble too much there, but my main focus was to essentially live the life of a fighter.
Fascinating. As far as what you just said there in terms of gatekeeping, I think most would agree. Most within, I'm generalizing it, within the mixed martial arts community would rather see a researcher write about this who's done it. If it's one time, two time, doesn't matter, right? You step into the proverbial cage from the lens of a practitioner, competitor, and an academic researcher. So I mean, it adds. I think, in my opinion, it adds a lot of credibility to the research. And it's interesting that. Sorry, I think you had a point.
No, I think you're 100% right, and the community kind of reciprocated those thoughts. I just don't want to make it seem like to study martial arts you got to go put yourself at an inherent risk. Um, but
It's an
yeah,
excellent point you're making, and I think you're covering the entire picture there. But I think for most, there's so many different stakeholders within the mixed martial arts community outside
mhm,
of just the fighting, right? There's the support staff, if you want to call them that, the coaches, the trainers, the promoters on the business side, the referees, and all that on the administrative end. So it's an entire sort of ecosystem, if we could say that.
yeah,
But
yeah. And within the Kansas City spaces, it kind of became even even more intimate for me. Like you watched the fight, I hope. I
oh
say
yes, of course,
uh,
absolutely.
people who are in my corner were people I've known for so long that I I felt beholden to them in a lot of ways to do these things. Like
Mm.
um, I I obviously wanted to be a part of the community, but I am a part of the community, and so it really, I don't want to make it seem like I had to do it for research either, because I like fighting a lot, and this is something that I wanted to do, and I had people behind me who loved me not just because of the research I did, but because we tied shoes together growing up, and
Mhm.
um, that really motivated me to do it in this way, I guess.
It's interesting. So you had a deep sort of personal connection to the community beyond just the research. But the theme of the research, it's interesting because you talk about Midwestern identity, and you're framing it particularly around Kansas City. Tell us about what is the Midwestern identity for folks who've never been to United States. Where is it? Can you situate it on the map? And I know it's a diverse one because it's the Midwest is a big piece of the America. But what's special? What makes Kansas City's Midwestern identity stand out?
Okay, no, that's a great question. So, Midwestern identity is kind of hard to explain, other than there's kind of a lot of like identity features that intersect for the MMA community. First off, Kansas City sits right on the border of Kansas and Missouri. I don't know if you know exactly where that is, like on a map. Kansas is pretty much directly in the center of the country, and Missouri is directly to the right of it. Um, Kansas City on itself is actually two different cities that separate at a state boundary. So there's Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri. Um,
But by the way, I don't mean to cut you off. My only reference to Kansas City in the broader,
mhm.
is through you familiar with Harley Race, professional wrestler Harley Race,
Oh yeah,
the legend, like Kansas City. Whenever I hear Kansas, I
yeah,
think Harley Race, or of course people talk about the Wizard of Oz. But please continue.
yeah. So in a modern setting for Kansas City, I think the Midwestern identity, um, and I don't want to speak for too many people because it's not ubiquitous. However, I think it kind of influences their disposition. But there's kind of a cultural Christian disposition in that the foundations of the city are pretty much along Christian lines. That doesn't necessarily mean everybody's Christian in the area, but they participate in Christian norms. Um, I would say, like using words like Jesus Christ for affirmations of shock or something along those lines. Or maybe if you don't even necessarily celebrate Christmas, being open to the idea of participating in a Christian event like Christmas. Stuff like that, to be a part of Kansas City is to know that like these things will exist and you have to be not, I don't want to say okay with it, but like you have to be participating in it in some way. I would also say that because the foundations of the city are very agrarian, there's a sort of blue collarness that gets attached to the community. Not that everybody necessarily is a farmer, but all of the land that is connected to the city is farmland. I'm from a town called Gardner, Kansas, which is a suburb of Kansas City, where it is you get outside of city limits and it's just fields of hay for days. You can just go
Wow.
straight and it's just hay. So there's a sense of blue collarness that gets attached to it as well. And when that mixes together, I think it is best represented in how stoic people become. They are they aren't necessarily afraid of difficult things or anything like that, but they deal with it in a way that uh, they try not to respond to it in a negative manner. But they just deal with it as quickly as possible in a way that minimizes their. Uh, I'm having a hard time explaining it, but Stoicism presents itself as a way for them to define identity. They're Stoic as a way to kind of signify their previous roots. I would even go as far as saying that their Stoicism is directly kind of a passed down Christian tradition that they will overcome. They will deal with the issues that have been presented to them because that's what they do and that's what they believe is right. This becomes even further reified within the MMA community as stoicism in the face of direct physical violence. You need to be able to take the punches and deal with it. You need to be able to do the training and continue training. Kind of not being able to do that isn't necessarily viewed as a negative as a person, but a negative as an MMA fighter. If you don't want to do those things, then you don't really want to be an MMA fighter. And that's fine, but you're taking time, space away from potentially other people who do.
Based on that, in terms of this identity and what frames it, and in relation to cultivating a mixed martial arts scene, how is Kansas City and their competitors and athletes from recreational to amateur to professional mixed martial artists, how do they differ from, say, New Yorkers, or say folks in Montreal, or say, Japanese mixed martial artists? Sorry, I'm throwing.
No, so the way I look at it is like there's going to be different levels of cultural framework that influence how people behave. So we'll start with like New York. Well, we both come from the same like American framework that I would say is latently Christian. So I think there's going to be some things that overlap. I don't know a ton about New York per se, but I do know that politically it's way more liberally open.
Right.
Um, when I was in Kansas City MMA spaces, it's not like they weren't inclusive, but it was predominantly male and predominantly white people participating. I think that
Right.
is kind of representative of demographics as well.
Right.
Uh, so if you get into New York, you might see more demographically diverse participants in
Right.
gym spaces. Um, I also wonder with things like I think that MMA fighters in New York would show stoicism in a way, but I feel like it foundationally might be a little different. It might have like Christian foundations, but I think that there's like a sense of being like New York street tough or something along those lines
Interesting.
that might
Interesting.
be incorporated into the same sort of function that stoicism does for the uh, Midwestern MMA fighters. For something like Montreal, that gets even more confusing. America and Canada are pretty similar in a lot of ways, except Quebec is kind of the outlier of that. In that Montreal is pretty much, I won't say 100% French speaking, but the main language in the space. So I think kind of French understanding of larger cultural issues. I don't know if like a French understanding of like how something like Stoicism within Christianity would be expressed. But I feel like you're still going to see a stance of Stoicism from Montreal mixed martial artists because it aligns with senses of masculinity that overlap from a foundation that's probably Christian in a lot of ways, uh, Western in a lot of ways. For Japanese mixed martial artists, I don't want to speak out of turn too much, but I have the feeling that it stems from like you'll see a lot of the same sort of behaviors, but it would stem from their martial arts tradition and their uh, like history of dealing with like invading adversaries and stuff like that. Um, those might be very generalized statements, and I can hear academics' brains melting in the background by me saying that stuff. But I just kind of want to throw it out there in kind of loose terms, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And another thing too is with if you can tell us, it's interesting you speak of the stoicism in that Midwestern identity, particularly in Kansas, and how that fits in well in terms of the culture within a dojo or MMA gym in particular. We know as fans of combat sports, we know that the Midwest tends to produce, at least the colleges and universities tend to have a lot of great wrestlers all across the U.S. You know, wrestling at the amateur level in the U.S. is really well supported. You have a lot of participation from kids as young as 5 all the way university and then on to international competition. How much of stoicism and in terms of that identity do you think crosses over to the wrestling culture in the U.S., but particularly within the Midwest, from your perspective?
See, and I have a little experience in those places as well. By wrestling in the Midwest. It's a I think it's apparent. Although I would think that at least when I wrestled in like 2005 to 2010 in the Kansas City region pretty hard. I think it's more religious the further you get away from city centers. I think that there's kind of like jokes of like farm boy strong or farm boy good or farm boy dedicated that are kind of tied to senses of rural identity that I think could be kind of parsed out into larger senses of like stoicism, like uh, for like Farm Boy Dedicated, there was always a joke that those dudes are going to be super technical, they're going to be in super strength, or they're going to be super strong, and they're going to be in great shape because they're dedicated to everything. They got to get up and do all the stuff on the farm before they even train, and if they're going to do all that stuff on the farm that we're doing, that's going to help them for how they train later. So there's kind of those types of things. Although, like I hate to use jokes as a specific uh, delineation of like cultural identity. Um, but uh, as to why it's so prevalent is just because it's in every school.
Hmm.
Um, when I was in middle school, as long as your school could produce a wrestling mat, I was in rural Kansas. I mean, they had wrestling tournaments and you could pay your fee and get 4 or 5 matches. And I think that a lot of places don't really have a comparable system to that. And that's why you see a lot of wrestlers come from America. Now, obviously, Russia has a big wrestling population that is starting to express itself with the highest levels of mixed martial arts. So I think you see just where it's supported. Um, However, I do think that like the grinding nature of wrestling, the aspects of like cutting weight, um, become internalized in a way that to deal with it, you have to be stoic. Like you have to cut weight. It's a terrible process that hurts so much, but the opposite of that is not being you. So they just deal with it.
Tell us what is, for those who might not know, what is Stoicism? I know it's almost, it seems like, but before you answer, it seems as though we're seeing I don't want to say a reemergence, or people are gravitating towards that. I'm beginning to see that in everything from sports memes to references from folks, everyday folks who may not really even understand what Stoicism is. Break it down for us, please. What is Stoicism?
So I view stoicism as like the ability to deal with adversity in a way that reifies concepts of masculinity towards your identity. And that's a really kind of theoretical way to kind of say, like, you just kind of grind your teeth and deal with it. And that becomes a way of you to express your identity. You become the grinder in a lot of ways. It's like, man, something sucks. Like, well, my car has a flat tire. Well, I'm going to put a new one on it and I'm still going to get to work. And then I'll deal with the flat later because that's what I got to do. And I don't know if that's necessarily unique, in that I think a lot of people exhibit it, but I think it becomes a way for people to signify Midwesterns. Like, it's not that like a lot of people are poor in these areas, it's that they deal with being poor through their stoicism. They might not have the same opportunities, but that doesn't mean they won't be in the same places. And there's also these kind of notions of predestination that appear in a lot of Christian religions that I think becomes sort of reified in Stoicism. And not that like they are stoic and they deal with these things because they know that that's how they appease their religious identity. They don't want to put burden on other people. They want to be able to handle their things, and if they handle those things in a good manner, they'll be rewarded for them. But it even goes further in that with predestination, in that like they know these challenges will be handled correctly because they're religious. It gets into a lot of like chicken and the egg scenario of philosophical foundation, but I think at the end of the day, there's a latent Christian belief that has been passed down through generation that is stoicism now. These people may not have the same sort of behaviors towards like social issues, but they still deal with the world in the same way. And I think it's in a lot of ways kind of toxic because you see it produced with hypermasculinity. Um, I love the fighting community, but when they say stuff like, I don't want to curse on here, but they'll use slurs or things like that to kind of show dominance before a fight. Like, I'm going to mess this dude up. I'm going to make this dude my so and so.
Right, right,
Uh,
right.
um, and I think that's a way for them to deal with nerves, but I also think that's a way for them to show their stoic demeanor. They're not, they're saving themselves for the gym or for the cage space, and their hyper masculinity is what's going to perform that. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little too far into jargon.
No, no, no.
But
You don't need to apologize, man. This is fascinating because I don't think we within the combat sports milieu as it applies to mixed martial arts, I don't hear these sorts of conversations and discussions. So please continue, because they're all very relevant.
Yeah, and I'm still kind of working over them. And I don't want to make it seem like negative, because I think you kind of have to be stoic and hypermasculine to be a fighter. Um, it it sounds really reductive to say it this way, but like, a fight is you're going to bully somebody if you want to win. Like, you have to go there, enact your will, have to do stuff they don't want you to do to them, and you have to hurt them in a way that's going to end up publicly humiliating them.
Right.
But you don't want to be nice about it, because you don't want to show like a weakness in your psyche, and it creates a sort of necessary toxicity. Like, I gotta go, like, when I was training, I gotta go in there and know that, like, man, I have to not like this person. Like, I have to sort of other them in a way, because I'm gonna be hurting them, and you don't want to hurt people you like. Some people can kind of get around that. Older fighters, kind of just look at it as business. They've been doing it for 15, 20 years. Like, they can't hate somebody they haven't talked to in 10 years. But when you're just getting into it, like, you kind of have to establish that you're legitimate in the space. And I think a lot of people do that by dealing with the damage, the fear, and the anxiety that fighting produces, and the culturally okay outburst or hyper-masculine.
Man, this is really interesting, because there's so many questions I can ask you on that. One of which is, do you think in terms of that hyper masculine approach that we see in a lot of the pre-fight trash talking and the hyping and so on, how much of that, and you're saying it's their demonstration of, I guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, in terms of them demonstrating their stoicism and trying to show their strength and their willingness
to participate.
That's right, to partake in that dance. How much of that is tied to culture, in terms of where one comes from? Because if we did a cross-cultural analysis of the global sort of culture around combat sports, you would see a lot of that. Quite frankly, you would see, and I know I'm generalizing. I don't want to say it's a distinctly American thing to trash talk. I mean, it can be to some extent, but you would see that in other cultures, and then you would see complete opposite, where things are more like, people don't sell emotion. They're very, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You know where I'm going with that?
Yeah. No, I agree with you in a lot of ways. And I think that if the larger culture accepts it more, not to get
Just say it, brother. It's all good.
So, like, within America, there's this idea of freedom of speech, and that, like, you can say pretty much anything. You have the right to say it, as long as it's not like directed hate speech.
Right.
And so I think that kind of breeds this sort of hyper masculine display. I think that for, like, again, I don't want to talk about Japan too much, but I've watched a ton of Japanese MMA. I used to love watching Pride and stuff back in the day.
Classic.
Yeah, they were maybe less emotionally outburst to kind of show their willingness to participate, but I think it would become more apparent in, like, stare downs, maybe not necessarily verbal gesturization, but like using their space or their own disposition to kind of just to kind of show their willingness. It's also weird in that, like, you can just look at the difference between Japanese fans and American fans. American fans are louder. There's a lot more chanting. There's a lot of unfortunate things that get said at American events, where Japanese fans are usually more quiet. And I think that's just a larger cultural focus on respecting the performance, perhaps. Whereas I think that there's a larger cultural focus with the United States of expressing your opinion. I think that's really, really loose again, and I'm sure there's academics who are disagreeing vehemently. Um, but that's my take from it. I was always raised to, if I didn't like something, that I should say it, and I don't. There's most definitely cultures where that's not the same. And after that's been reified for 25, 30 years, perhaps it expresses itself in a stare down, me saying, I'm going to F you up, you know? Uh, but that's a tough question for me to answer without doing like full on cross cultural studies.
For sure, for
Uh,
sure. No, I hear you. I appreciate that. I know it's a tough question, but I kind of I want to know, in terms of your research, Patrick, what name one thing that really surprised you about the Kansas City MMA scene when you put your academic lenses on as an anthropologist. What one thing really surprised you the most in your research that you don't think you would have captured before had you not,
so this is kind of outside the purview of martial arts and more of the purview of dealing with the 2020 election and COVID. But there kind of became and this just wasn't with the MMA community, though I saw it with the MMA community. And I think it, like I said, I think it was more of a manifestation of all the external pressures people were feeling. But a lot of people started engaging in conspiracy theories and openly engaging in conspiracy theories. I had kind of seen that before with one respondent in my research from a previous project being into things like Bigfoot, but he did it because he just had an interest in it. Whereas I think the pressures of the COVID pandemic and the instability of the 2020 election, um, a lot of people started believing in conspiracy theories and propagating conspiracy theories because I think it confirmed their worldview. I think they were really scared, and a lot of these people look back at this time and don't agree with those positions. A lot of anti-vax rhetoric was spread during this time, and I think it wasn't necessarily people were afraid of the vaccine as much as they were just afraid of everything else, and the misinformation, lack of transparency, um, that is just dealing with a global phenomenon like the pandemic. Um, it it really, I don't want to say it hurt because I don't want to sound like I was that emotionally invested, but it was tough talking to people that I really respected, and then they would uh, portray these beliefs that were really disgusting in some ways. And I maybe I'm generalizing it by saying like I just think they were scared in a lot of ways, and I don't think it necessarily affected their overall behavior in that like face-to-face interactions. I don't think were changed by conspiracy theory. But like if you really started to get under the kind of mask that people put on, you started to hear some people discussing things that were really interesting. For a while, there were some in the community that were vehemently anti-academia, which came into a weird conversation because it's like, my guy, that's me. You're talking to people like me right now. I'm the boogeyman, and you like me. Um, and so that was a good way to kind of address those issues. But I also got a lot of like, you're one of the good ones, though, my man. Like you understand us, so that's why we do it. But if we just had some other academic, like I don't know, man, like it might get a little more confusing. And so I think my like being from the space and also participating with them in every way allowed me to talk to them about these things that they wouldn't have talked to other people. Um, but it also, I think, kind of showed an underlying sort of the Midwestern psyche that like they're more willing to confirm beliefs about their worldview than they are to deal with like scientific research, and that hurt.
wow,
I'll,
wow.
I'll be honest. I'll be that it hurt. I had somebody talking to me, and he goes, "So you're a social scientist?" And I was like, "Yeah, I mean, yeah, I do work within the fields of like anthropology and cultural anthropology and sociology are very closely tied." And he asked me, "Are you brainwashed?" And I didn't know how to answer that, man.
Oh man,
I,
I want to not believe you, but I clearly do, because unfortunately this is the state of
of this discourse. And I want to preface it by saying that I tried to talk to these people and really make them think about their logical, how the way they were coming to these conclusions logically, but I didn't try to enforce like a force of change on them. I just know that it's tough. Like I don't think I should be segmented from other academics, and that's maybe where I go back to this idea earlier that we were talking about gatekeeping. I don't think I should be able to do the research because I'm me, but my MMA community definitely thinks that. Um, and it puts me in a weird space. And I would go further and say I have a ton of respect and adoration for these people. I think conspiracy theories are something malicious that need to be investigated further. I think that it really affects the way people view the world. And once you get into that framing, it's very hard to come out of it. When nothing's truth, nothing's truth. So it becomes hard to talk to those people. I think that's subsiding a lot now. I think that the pandemic kind of ending, like people not dying from the vaccines and stuff like that, um, is kind of changing that notion. But I also think that some people double down too hard. So that's them, and that's tough to deal with.
It's very interesting that you discovered that through your through your research as an anthropologist. I'd like to know, in terms of your training and the entire the entire experience of lining up a fight, going through the training regiment and so on. What can you tell us about that experience? And in
So
terms of, yeah, go ahead, please go for it.
so I was training pretty much every day except Sunday. And that was the day I tried to take off to let my body recover. I would do jujitsu 4 or 5 times a week. I would do striking usually 3 or 4 times a week, and then I would spar once a week. Um, Part of that though was me trying not to be depressed dealing with the pandemic. I couldn't get back to my wife in Canada. There were issues at the border because I wasn't a Canadian citizen. I was kind of, I don't want to say forced, but the best option was to continue research. And so training so often allowed me to kind of come to peace with the things I couldn't control. And it made me realize that's why I think a lot of fighters do it. The training spaces give them a place to express themselves, to have outbursts, to maybe get emotional, to work through things with people they adore. And it allowed me to do that to deal with the pandemic. And towards the end of it, I wanted to set up a fight because I wanted to go home. And it got really hard to do so. I actually had an opponent lined up. Mother's Day was a week before the fight was supposed to happen. He had 2 kids. He was in his 40s. All of a sudden, the day after Mother's Day, he doesn't want to fight.
Hmm.
I think it's a little suspicious. I think he probably talked to somebody and they convinced him not to do it, that there is no
Wow.
reason for him to fight. And that's cool. But that hurt, man. Like, I remember just like crying, just being so
Wow.
angry that
Wow.
I wanted to be home. I didn't really want to train anymore. Like it, you would put so much into it. Like I worried about, I've spent so much time and money making my brain good. And then I was knocked out a couple times in my
Wow.
research. And it's like, I don't want to do this anymore, but I owe it to myself and I owe it to my community to make it happen. And we luckily convinced a person to take a fight on short notice, and that's who ended up fighting me. And I respect my opponent a ton. I think that honestly, he is incredibly brave for doing something like that. Um, but it was a roller coaster of emotions. I find out Sunday night, Monday morning, that fight's off, and I'm just furious. I'm thinking about like, man, maybe should I go out and buy some alcohol? Should I, like this is terrible. And then Tuesday we have a fight set up and you need to go get blood work and stuff like that. And it made me realize how fragile the MMA system is for the fighters. you could show up and do everything right and your opponent isn't there, and guess what? You don't get paid. It sucks, but that's the way it is. I obviously was an amateur, so I wasn't getting paid anyways. But it it's a system that's based upon personal responsibility and discipline, and you can already see how that has issues. So you get into situations. I did it for my opponent, but my opponent said he couldn't make weight. He couldn't make 265 pounds on like 6 or 7 days notice. I gave him 10 more pounds extra so he could show up at 275 and fight. That wasn't a big deal for me, but if you're 140 pounds and your opponent says, I want to make it 155 pounds now, man, 15 pounds is a lot. And should I put myself at a disadvantage so I can make some money? I know a lot of people who would,
Right.
you know,
Of course. Yeah.
and the show wants it to happen. So you're just kind of this super important gear in a system that is going to exploit you. And I think that's tough for a lot of fighters to deal with. And I think a lot of fighters think there's a lot more money in it than there actually is until you establish yourself. So from my perspective, like I fear for the safety of amateur fighters. Training is dangerous and you can get hurt really easily. And I know tons of people who didn't have health insurance. In the States, there's obviously no universal health care. So
right.
People who could break a bone and it's a $12,000 thing to get an x-ray and a cast and things like that.
Yikes.
But that's their dream, right? Like,
right.
What else do they have? They can work manual labor and there's honor in that. And if you want to do that, that's great, but they
Absolutely.
want more.
Right.
And they think that there's space in MMA for that. And promotions and sometimes coaches are way too willing to take advantage of it. To kind of wrap up on a more positive note, I think that their participation in MMA actually does make them better people. We've talked about hypermasculinity and conspiracy theories and stuff like that, and the exploitation kind of the system produces. But without MMA, I've heard so many people tell me I'd be arrested. Man. Like I'd go to a bar and somebody would say something and I would lose it, and that's not cool. And so I think that MMA provides an outlet for a lot of young men that I don't want to say are forgotten, but at least in America, I think there is a fear of kind of retributive violence that is really common with young men. They get slighted and then they react to it. Whereas I think going to an MMA gym and just getting that aggressive urge out really quick allows them to sit down and think. And I want that to be the highlight of my research, that this is providing something for people that they need that society isn't doing. And I hate to kind of say violence is good, but for some ways it can be constructive and recreational in ways that helps people better themselves. And that's something I think that needs to be explored. I think I say this all the time in academic circles and people get mad at me, but I think humans are inherently violent. There's things that at a certain point, everybody will use violence as a social tool. And that sucks, but I think we need to recognize it. I've heard so many people, there's a mass shooting problem in the United States. And I don't know if you've recently heard about Texas.
Of course. Yes.
And man, that really messed me up. But I was in the message boards with some of the fighters and people were like, what if we got him in jiu-jitsu, man? Or what if we got him in boxing? Maybe this dude's aggression goes out the door when he can be humbled a little bit, or he can realize these things. And I don't want to make it sound like it seems like a really reductive argument to be like, yeah, the dude who committed a mass shooting should have just should have performed violence recreationally and maybe we'd be in a better place. But I've seen angry men become loving fathers. And I think it's through the transformation that martial arts can provide. And that's what I want. That's what I want my research to, at least as the golden core of it, to be like, MMA is good for people. maybe not everyone, and people definitely get hurt, but at the end of the day, a lot of men come in as emotionally jaded individuals and can kind of leave in a better place.
Very, very interesting points. I don't have, I have a few more minutes with you, but I do want to do this again. If you're cool with that, I'd like to do this again. And because there's so much more to explore in terms of just combat sports from your perspective and experience. But I want to know, tell us, you won that match in a decisive fashion. Your opponent tried to take you down, you countered, landed in mount, grounded, pounded, you won. For you, what did that moment mean to you? And if, in a few minutes, please.
Oh, absolutely. It was the culmination of a lot, and I felt so great afterwards. I had people in the crowd that I had wrestled with in high school and middle school, and I had my family in the crowd because, you know, they're from the Kansas City area. And just to like know that that was the end of it, the pandemic, I was double vaccinated by that point, so getting back into Canada was becoming easier and easier, and I kind of had a pathway to do it, and I finished it, and just the moment of elation was so much that I don't even know how to quantify it. I joke about like how I didn't black out in my fight, but some of it is hard to remember.
Wow.
Like I remember taking him down. I remember hitting him at one point, and it felt like his eye moved, which kind of felt gross. But in at the conclusion of it, like I knew it was worth it. And when I was talking to other fighters, like losing sucks. There's nothing like losing an MMA fight. You know, you do all this work in preparation to fail, and then you get beat up on top of it. But winning is so good, and it felt amazing. I don't know how to experience other than like I'm 31 now. I'm still thinking that, man, maybe I'd like to do an amateur fight again. Like maybe I could still prove something to myself. Maybe there's something I can still learn about me in the gym and in the cage. And I think I'd like to explore that further. I think for a lot of the fighters, it's just a moment that reconfirms their identity. If it's their first fight, they're now a fighter.
Correct.
If it's their first win, now they're a winner. If it's, you know, if they've won a lot, it means they're doing the right things, you know. Whereas the opposite side of it, those kind of things still happen, but they think they can just improve. It's tough. It's tough to see people lose, but when you win, like it feels like the stars aligned and something great happened.
Now, Pat, last question for you. How was the experience at Carleton University as a PhD student? In a minute, if you could just summarize it.
Absolutely. I love the staff and the students. I think that the pandemic is a mess, and no university was prepared for it. I was really frustrated they couldn't get me back across the border, but I think they're doing the right things to make up for it now. I think I would try to personally change some things if I was in charge, but I think we all would. And I respect Carleton a lot for giving me the opportunity.
Right on, man. Well, thank you very much for your time. I do want to speak with you again in the near future. You're still working on your dissertation, right?
Yep. I'm hoping that maybe the fall semester we'll be able to wrap things up, but there's a lot of stuff where we got to get readers outside of the department, stuff like that, squared away before we can even get to that point. So a lot of bureaucratic, clerical stuff.
I bet. I'm looking forward to speaking with you during that phase of when you're wrapping up the dissertation, and we can dive into it some more. Thank you very much for your time. Have a wonderful day.
You too, man. Thanks for having me.
Cheers.